Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. In today's episode, we are going to be making a Halloween costume. I plan on going to Salem this year for Halloween night, and I need a really fun costume, but I knew I wasn't going to have a lot of time to pull it off. So basically, what I'm creating is not going to ultimately end up in the Met, but it will look really, really fun for the night of. And so I figured it would be fun to make an episode showing you how to pull something like this off, even if you're in a hurry. I've been really excited about this project because this is my very first chance to use the dress form that I made a couple of years ago. My plan is to make a witch's costume from about the 1760s, kind of very reminiscent of Dark Shadows. And so my very first step is going to be creating a pattern for the corset that is going to go over the top of the entire outfit. I'm using an inexpensive muslin to create this pattern, and then once I'm really happy with the final design, then I will lay this on top of the actual fabric that I'll be using and begin cutting that out. After I was happy with each individual piece, I would lay it down on a fresh piece of fabric and mark out a seam allowance around each one. And in case you haven't delved into too much sewing, a seam allowance is basically a border that goes all the way around a piece of a pattern. And it's usually about a ½ inch. And essentially what it does is it gives you a little bit of wiggle room in case something ends up being a little too tight. And it also keeps the stitch away from the edge, which sort of eliminates the chances of your seam coming undone. I can already tell this is going so much faster than my typical method of building a pattern. Normally I'm putting little pieces on myself and taking them off, and it's this really long drawn out process. This is just going by so quickly, it's incredible. So I don't know, something about having a dress form right there that you can stick pins into and she won't scream is making this so much more pleasant. The seams of the corset that I'm creating they kind of go straight down the middle in the back and in the front, and it's a symmetrical pattern, so I really only need to design one half of it. When I was about 16 years old, I found a box of my grandmother's sewing materials stashed away up in the attic, and my mom kind of let me just sort of experiment and play with what I had. So I never really got a, standard tutorial or lesson on how to sew, and much of my knowledge has come from just sort of stumbling around and finding things that worked and things that didn't. And because of that, I've never gotten into using patterns. I've always just sort of figured out how to do it myself. And I think there's a little bit of insecurity that comes with learning things yourself like that, because you end up with a bit of imposter syndrome and worry that people that really know what they're doing or professionals see what you do and maybe have a little bit of judgment. But at the end of the day, I've usually been pretty happy with what I've made. And I think that's really kind of the most important takeaway, is that even if you don't do something textbook perfect, so long as you're happy with what comes of that, that's honestly what matters. Now that the pattern is completely done, I can actually start using it to cut out the actual fabric for the costume. In preparation for this episode, I went into the city to my favorite fabric store, B&J Fabrics, and my friend Lewis works there, and he is so wonderful. He always helps me find everything I need, and he set me up with this material called coutil, and it's used for corset making, and it is going to be the foundation of the corset. What makes it so ideal for this is how dense, soft, and sturdy it is all at once. And so when you're building a corset, you want to be pulling yourself in, shaping yourself, and you need something really stable to do that. For the outer layer, all I did was lay that cutout coutil directly onto it, iron it together, and just cut it straight out. Something about the texture of both of the fabrics were kind of grabbing each other, and it made this very easy to do. So as I'm sewing these layers together, I'm only stitching along the sides that are going to be joining another piece of fabric. And my reason for that is I'm actually going to be adding boning channels where we're going to be inserting boning in the top and the bottom. So if I sealed those, I wouldn't be able to do that. So you definitely want to leave those open. Once that step had been done, I can actually start sewing the pattern pieces together. The straps were a little tiny bit different, and I needed to actually sew them together and then flip them inside out, and then from there they could be pressed and then sewn to the rest of the piece. In the back where the corset is going to lace together, you want a lot of stability. So I actually doubled over the fabric here, pressed it down, and then sewed it together. On the back where the eyelets are going to go, I just marked every 1.5 inches and used just one of those little kits that you can pick up from any kind of hobby store. I got mine from Joann's. And you just punch a hole, or cut a hole in this case, work the little piece through, and then follow the directions to hammer it all together. With the design I'm going for, the straps are actually disconnected and then you lace them together. Now it's together and I can actually start sewing in those boning channels. This is a step that seems really complicated, but is actually mind-bogglingly simple. All you do is you do these stitches that are probably about a 1/2 inch apart. I'm not even sure I measured them precisely. And you just sew a bunch of lines and you just take boning that you could just get at any hobby store and start pushing that through all of those channels. Once all of the boning was in, I just hand stitched all of the entrances to lock them in place. I don't plan on wearing anything other than a bra directly under this, so for that reason, I will need a modesty panel just on the back where the corset comes together, just so you don't see any skin underneath the laces. To attach this, all you need to do is sew it onto the allowance that's on the inside where those eyelets are. Okay, this corset is really coming along and I'm loving how it's turning out, but I'm going to set it aside for a moment and start putting the skirts together. I'm creating a circle skirt for the base, and so all I need to do is measure from my waist to the floor, fold a piece of fabric into 4s, and then in the corner, just pin down the measuring tape, and then just sweep it across, cut that out, and that will give me a circular skirt. I'm cutting a fairly good size hole out of the center, and then from this, I'm actually going to put it over my dress form and then just create a couple pleats to give a little bit of gathering right at my hips. Once I was happy with how those pleats were pinned, then I just baste stitched them together, which is just kind of like a practice stitch. And then after that's all done, I can run it through the machine and make these pleats permanent. To make it so that I can get the skirt on and off, I'm just going to do a split here in the back, then I'm going to sew some ribbon around the waistline, and this will just tie together. My last step will be to just sew a hem on this, and we should be ready to move on to the next part. Now that the base skirt is done, I actually need to create a foundation garment that is going to create that 1700 silhouette that I'm going for. This is a step that I had never done before, and I expected it to be really complicated or difficult, and it was so preposterously simple, I can't even tell you. All I did was draw out a really basic shape, cut out 2 pieces of it, and sew them together. And then I just stitched on a little bit of a fluffy lace to puff it up and make it seem a little bit fancier than it was. Filled it with polyfill, and from there, I just sewed another ribbon around the waist of it, and it just ties on. It could not have been more simple. Okay, so initially I filled this thing with just straight polyfill, and what happened when I did that was it just created a lot of airy volume, and it was just too poofy, and it was kind of creating an unflattering shape. And so I pulled all of that out, and then I took some of the seeds from my witch's broom project that I did, put that in, and what that did was it kind of just gave it some weight, which it really needed. Then I added just a dash of the polyfill back to smooth out the shape, and it seemed to be the perfect solution. I'm now going to take a crinkled gauze and just go over the front of the base skirt. And what this will do is I'm going to be going over the back with a different kind of fabric, and this is just going to add another layer and a little bit of texture that you'll see right from the front. Next, I'm taking a plaid woven cotton and I'm cutting just straight along the lines, keeping everything really even. I like this particular fabric because it has a fairly authentic 1700s-ish kind of look to it, and it is just going to go almost like a reverse apron around the back. So now that we are working on this top layer, let's take a second to chat about how I'm doing these pleats. I've been working overtime trying to stop too much bulk from happening just below my waistline. And the way I'm doing that is I'm only sewing this top and leaving this edge kind of floating underneath the skirt. And what this will do is it allows the fabric to just kind of lay smooth and interesting. And in addition to that, it stops bulk from happening just at the top of your hip, where I tend to think it looks the most unflattering. Once I was really happy with how it was all laying, I just hand stitched those pleats together and then ran it once again through the sewing machine. Once it was ready, I just sewed another ribbon around the top of the waist, and this will just tie together like those bottom 2 layers. And I'm now ready to move on to the sleeves. So technically you would wear like an undershirt with something like this, but I don't want any bulk where the corset is cinching my waist. I want to look as small as I can possibly manage. And so for that reason, I'm actually just sewing sleeves directly onto this corset. And the way I do this is you measure the circumference of the arm opening, and then I'm just going to draw out a pattern onto an inexpensive muslin. That top curve you see is the part that is going to sew onto the perimeter or the arm opening of the corset. And so all you want to do is make sure that that length is at least as long as the perimeter. And I'm actually adding probably around 6 inches to that. And I'm going to be gathering this and creating a little bit of a ruched effect at the top of the shoulder. Now that we're going to be tackling the sleeves, I wanted to tell you I went to B&J Fabric in New York, and my friend Lewis found me this stuff, and it's called a crinkle silk chiffon, and it is so ghostly and airy. It's just going to be the absolute perfect fabric for these sleeves. I always recommend hand stitching sleeves on because sometimes you have to make a few adjustments and it's a lot easier to do with your hand than necessarily it is to do with a machine. Now I'm just doing a little bit of gathering with that excess fabric. So the area you want to focus with these pleats is right at the top of your shoulder, midway down the front, and that's where all of that gathering should lie. Once the sleeves were fully affixed, I now wanted to take some lace, do a little bit of ruching and gathering with it, just along the bust of the corset and right at the wrists of the sleeves. The lace on the wrists was a lot trickier just because that fabric, like I mentioned, is so delicate and it wants to slip out of your fingers really quickly. And I'm trying to gather directly onto it. So this part was pretty fiddly, but it did ultimately work out. Instead of using a modern material like an elastic to tighten up these wrists against my skin, what I'm actually doing is doing a few sort of choice stitches of this silk ribbon, and I'm just kind of spacing a little bit extra of the fabric underneath the ribbon, and then I'll just be able to tie this together and it will look really, really delicate and soft when it's on. Towards the end, I realized I wanted a little bit of a laced up effect right here in the front of the bust. And so I used the seam ripper that my friend Gonzalo Plaza made for me, which I just absolutely love. And I'm going to punch another set of eyelets all down the front. I'm spacing these about an inch apart and using a finer twine to give it a slightly more delicate effect. I then laced through a fine twine in the back and finished it with a pretty little bow in the front. The final thing I did was make a witch's hat using that screen material that I showed you how to do last year. And I didn't film this process simply because we already have an episode showing that pretty thoroughly. And this one looks really great, but is a much kind of shoddier version of the one I made earlier. And we are all done, and I totally love how this turned out. It's really fun to take a break from sewing and come back to it and find there's still so much to learn, and I love surprising myself with an end result, and this did that for me. So this episode should be coming out in tandem with a witch's broom episode, so look forward to that. I hope you enjoy these both. Going into Christmas, I'm going to be getting back into baking, so look forward to that. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon. Have a happy Halloween.